Yeah, everything looks good to me.
Yeah, we can see him.
Great. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining me. I know that everyone is busy, and I appreciate people taking the time on a Wednesday to sit down with us. This is the third webinar in a series of five webinars that Procopio is putting on with our great partner, the Association of Corporate Counsel of San Diego, and I really appreciate everything they've done to help us put this together. So today we're going to focus on litigation finance and cross strategies and IP disputes. With me presenting is Casey Kempner, and he is the Chief Legal Officer of P&P Imports. And Casey, I always think it's helpful to sort of people to have a little bit of background on you and the company you work for so they understand the context in which you sort of view the topic we're talking about. So can you just talk a little bit about P&P's business and sort of the types of IP issues that you come across, the types of IP that you guys have and protect, just so people have an understanding of sort of the lens through which you view the topics today.
Yeah, so a little bit of a background. Kind of came from big law, worked at Haynes and Boone doing patent litigation for a number of years before I went in-house. Currently, I'm in charge of our legal team. We have a patent prosecutor, we have a litigation associate, and we have a senior corporate counsel on our team. Um, the company makes sporting goods products, outdoor games, consumer goods. We have about 1,500 different SKUs across a wide variety of categories. Um, we utilize IP to try to protect those products, protect our sales, deal with infringement. Our general IP strategy is to try to get as many pieces of IP as efficiently as possible, um, and try to do most of it in-house. So that includes drafting a lot of design patents for low-tech articles, making sure that everything that we do is copywritten appropriately, and then also utilizing trademark protection across the board on nearly every product. Um, as we have expanded, obviously we see a lot of infringements from new entrants out of China mainly are most of the knockoffs, factories out of China copying products and third-party sellers. We utilize those IP assets to do a lot of takedowns on different marketplaces and enforce those. And then we also do litigate as needed. Um, when I got here at P&P, we had a number of cases I litigated quite frequently back in 2018 through 2020. Um, and then as kind of the change of infringements and abilities to police on marketplaces, we were able to do that a little more efficiently without having to litigate as much. And then the current trends that we're seeing is the infringements are actually expanding quite rapidly with the advent of AI and people's abilities to copy with lack of human oversight. And so we see the infringement problem growing rapidly across the board, not just our company, from friends and other industries that we've seen. Infringements growing, and so now is the time to be more strategic than ever, because it can be a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole, and if you expend too many resources on any one given focus, you're either going to overspend or just not be able to handle the multitude of different infringements. So strategy becomes a very key important part on trying to go forward efficiently.
Great. Okay. Uh, Casey, you want to take care of the disclaimer real fast?
Yeah, I will. It's obviously it's general education purposes, not legal advice. I'm not your attorney. I'm here to just talk about my own personal beliefs on these matters, and this isn't a representation of P&P and their own company viewpoints. This is mine and mine alone. Happy to answer any questions.
Great. So what are we here to talk about today? So first, just initially, this is not a lit funding or litigation finance presentation per se. What it's really about is how you should balance costs, both economics and time, with larger business goals in IP disputes. And in that context today, we're sort of going to hone in on the core premise of the presentation is that budget is litigation strategy. And around that core sort of guiding principle, we'll talk about the economic realities of IP litigation, finance fundamentals, budgeting and cross control strategies, alternative fee structures, and practical guidance for in-house counsel. Why does cost strategy matter? Well, fundamentally, cost discipline, as I've said, is a core part of litigation strategy. And why is that? Well, because even strong cases can become economically irrational. Litigation costs affect leverage and settlement, and sophisticated companies manage disputes intentionally. And so, in light of all of those things, you really do have to be focusing on cost. And a key point is just that winning legally and winning economically are not always the same thing. And sort of given that reality, how do you make sure that you are both winning legally and winning economically at the same point? So, Casey, how did time and costs impact litigation strategy in your view?
Yeah, internally in-house, I think one of our biggest considerations is actual resource time of personnel. And there is the cost component. We can kind of figure out and get a good budget about what litigation is going to cost, what we're going to expect to spend on something, what we think the dispute's worth. Um, a lot of times the principals and other people might not fully appreciate just the time suck that some of these matters take and don't fully weigh that as part of the actual costs. And so if you have your legal team, managing, three outside cases, that can become just a massive time suck internally, where that means maybe your product clearances slow down slightly, your patent review process slows down slightly. All of those internal hits are real world costs to the company. They do slow down, they do take away from revenue and profitability. Um, so understanding internally how it's going to affect your staff and your just time load um, is a analysis that I don't think people do enough and need to focus on. Um, so I think that's kind of my big point is we need to understand what's really the goal of the litigation. What's the goal of taking action against an individual infringer or a situation, and ultimately it's you need to balance what do you want to do? Is it something where it's going to be cheaper, easier to write a quick C&D or take something down off a marketplace rather than file a lawsuit? Filing a lawsuit is just more internal resources. Even if you can do it cheaply internally, you can have your team draft it. You still got to consider the time it takes to do it. So making sure that everyone's aligned on not only the cost that it's going to take, but also the personnel drain that's going to take, and looking at that comprehensively with like the end result. And ultimately, if you're at a company like us, we have so many different products and so many different infringements concurrently. If you're pulling from column A, you're taking from column B. So it's a kind of a combination of balancing out where do you want to put your resources. So you're constantly pressure setting all of these things, and things change dynamically. Litigation is a long process, um, and sometimes if you bring a case and you're spending all these resources, you might have another target that might be more important. And now you're kind of sucked into litigation on something and draining resources there where the focus should be something else. And now you're being prevented. So making sure you're aligned and staying up to date on the realities of the business economics as things go along, because they do change. It's not something you can just analyze day one and think it's going to be the same 6 months or a year down the road.
I think what you said about making sure that you have a defined, agreed upon goal on day one is critically important. I just could not agree more. And it's something that when anybody comes to me about wanting to talk about a litigation, before I get into anything with them, it's always, well, why do you want to do this and what are you trying to achieve? And if we don't have a clear vision on that, we're never going to get to an end place where people are happy. And so I think all of this revolves around that. Okay, where does this fit in with the larger webinar series that we've done? So in parts 1 and 2, we sort of talked about how in-house and outside counsel should be managing IP disputes. We talked about having an IP strategy in part 2. And today we're just going to be talking about sort of cost management and litigation. And then in the next 2 to 4 weeks, we're going to have parts 4 and 5. And those are going to really focus on how to execute the strategy that we've discussed in parts 1 and 3. And then in part 5, how to obtain an optimum recovery. So I hope that you've been coming for all of these, but I understand the time constraints, maybe not. But if 4 and 5 interest you, we'd love to have you join us for the subsequent presentations. Okay, the economics of IP litigation. Let's really get started here. What drives expenses in IP cases, and why are they on balance more expensive than other types of commercial litigation? Well, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody on this call that IP cases are generally more expensive because of their technical complexity, which drives expert and discovery costs. There's also the potential for parallel proceedings, although I'd say now with what's going on under the current administration with squires of the PTO, the availability of the PTAB is sort of diminished. There still are some other venues you can go to, so it's not eliminated, but that aspect has gone down slightly. And then discovery volume often exceeds expectations. Casey, from your point of view, what's most surprising to the non-legal stakeholders in your company about these cost drivers? Like, which one of them stands out most for you when you're talking with your business people and trying to sort of align on a goal and the litigation strategy?
Yeah, I think experts are still kind of maybe a sore subject for most of the stakeholders. I think that no one really enjoys spending $100,000 or more on an expert witness. Those costs creep up. Sometimes you even got to, tell people that you need more than one expert. You potentially could be looking at an expert on utility patent, claim construction. You could be looking at a different branding expert on trade dress. You could be looking at a damages expert. And so while the stakeholders might understand that they need an expert and they realize that they're expensive per hour. Sometimes they might not consider that that might be a $300,000 to $500,000 bill, depending on how you're asserting your claims. And so part of that goes back to strategy. You might have 20 different claims that you could bring, but sometimes adding a trade dress claim is going to add in a couple different surveys, a couple different experts, and greatly increase your just kind of your fixed expert costs. Um, so I think they understand the concepts of experts, but sometimes don't realize just how complex cases can get, especially in the IP field, and the need for multiple experts. It's like, oh, you got one expert. They're like, well, can't he just opine about everything? And we love that when it happens, but sometimes that's not the case, and you're ending up with multiple experts. And so having that is always a surprise. And then in addition, um, you never know what your opponent's going to do. You might think that a case is going to be fairly straightforward, and then the other side, wants to challenge something silly like venue, even though it's straightforward, and then you're dealing with like a limited venue discovery over a number of weeks, and now before you even got the case really going, you're tens of thousands or more, or 100,000 into it. Um, and that's surely because you're dealing with a very aggressive, litigious opponent on the other side, who brings atypical motions or practices that drive up the costs. And so they might be like, well, we were able to do this case before for X amount of dollars. How come, we haven't even gotten to the expert level and we're already 4X that cost? So there's the uncertainty of the opponent is always kind of a bit of a mixed bag, and so those things are I think troubling for stakeholders because they want predictability, and those things are really hard to predict.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we can only control what we can control. Do you find yourself in those situations when you're going to internal stakeholders, sort of saying to them, this is sort of best case, middle of the road scenario, and then this is the worst case scenario in terms of budget if the opposing counsel is incredibly litigious and that sort of thing. Is that a strategy that you've used successfully to try and make sure that there isn't some big surprise at the end of the day with your internal stakeholders if the budget, ends up going up dramatically because there's unnecessary venue disputes and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's key and kind of goes back to one of your original points about making sure that the goals are aligned at the very beginning. And so for me, I'd much rather um, undersell and over deliver. And the undersell is literally giving them worst case scenarios, full potential, all the bad stuff, how you potentially could lose, what it could cost, how it could go sideways, how you could potentially, be end up paying on the back end. Really, I view my job internally is to make sure that they're aware of everything. And as long as they're aware of everything, then we can sit down, we can have a frank conversation about, is this the right play? Is that upper end risk level too much? Should we pick a different plan of attack? Um, so I think full disclosure is always better. I've never had that go sideways. I think the other case where it's like if you just try to give them a best case scenario and it doesn't end up best case, people are always frustrated, even if it was a good result or just slightly over. So I think you want to tell them what you expect, but at the same time, disclose all those little nuances that you've experienced over the years about how things can go sideways and what the potentials are. So um, they're not hearing it for the first time. It's at least like, okay, I told you we might need five experts on this case. And like, okay, well now we're at the point and we are going to need those five experts. This is the way it's going to go. We didn't drop any claims. It's moving forward. And this is what we're going to need. And so you don't want to just sit here and they think they're going to need a single expert and then you get down and you tell them you need five experts down the road. It's like that's something you probably should have analyzed when you filed your case. You had that claim, you had that goal setting, you realized what you're getting into, and they've at least heard it at least once before. So full disclosure is always better.
Okay. So we sort of talked a little bit about what the main cost drivers are, and now let's look at how those cost drivers sort of map out across the life cycle of the litigation from beginning to end. And as you noted a couple of minutes ago, it really is the pleadings and early motion stage right up front that sort of defines the contours of what the budget is going to be. And if you add in a bunch of trade dress claims or something like that, it's going to increase the cost of the case. You add in patent claims, going to increase the cost of the case. So having a defined goal up front and then figuring out the best scope of claims that can get you that goal and sort of be within what the cost constraints are is what you should be focusing on. Um, you know, we also hit on the discovery is and experts are often the biggest driver. Discovery is kind of spread out throughout the case in its whole from once you get a case management order until sort of right before the end of close of fact discovery. There's a little bit of blip. Experts, tend to be at very high towards the end before summary judgment when you've got expert reporting deadlines. And then the other big one where you see sort of a massive spike or bolus is the trial preparation and actual trial costs where, you've got entire teams spending 10, 12 hours a day for weeks and weeks prepping for trial or in trial. So of all the things we talked about in the sort of the different timing aspects, Casey, where do you focus most aggressively on trying to control spend? And I spend in the broad from both a sort of a cash and then time point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that there's not necessarily one aspect where I'm trying to aggressively kind of control spend, but one aspect where I think that it's very beneficial, and if we didn't do it, would be a waste of money. And so, to me, I think the control spend is something that I really want to control. I want to control wasted cash. I don't want to have outside counsel be struggling to search the internet, piecemeal the facts about the company or the nuances of the technology or educate them themselves. Typically in-house, you are the experts. You know your stuff. You know the documents. You know the technology. You know the patents. You know where the traps are. So making sure that you're prepared on the front end, which includes like making sure all your documents are together and it's not having a third party come in and do a big discovery push. It's like, where all the documents that are relevant to the case, you're having your internal teams get those together as that case is initially getting put together. You can save some time there. And then we also make sure that if we can do first drafts, write motions, a lot of the written work we'll try to do internally because mainly we believe that we know our company more than the outside counsel will, and so we rely on them for, strategy, nuances, red flags. But we don't want to have to put on them to be the expert about the company when that's really our position. And so that's where we can save the most costs is educating outside, making sure that they understand what we know and where our resources are, and make sure that they know what assets internally that they can rely on. And so if I have an in-house counsel that is really the expert on a certain matter, making sure that I connect them directly with the right associate on the other side, so those two are working together and we're not, playing telephone around the clock between, different elements. So utilizing your inside resources as best as you can based on their own skill sets. And that might just be managing discovery. It might just be doing, quick reviews, but figure out what your team is strong at and making sure that you're not paying outside counsel to do those jobs. Because frankly, I think that outside counsel doing those jobs, it's not where everyone's efforts are just best utilized.
Yeah, and that when we prepped for this a couple of days ago, that was, I think, unique about what you were talking about and how you try and control costs, where you actually have your in-house legal team helping to draft, fact sections and stuff like that, because your people know the background of the company and all of that so much better than outside counsel, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. Was that something that you started? Like, where did you learn that? Because it's not something that I think a lot of people do. So where did sort of that epiphany come to you?
I think that was probably when PMP when I first joined PMP, they had 11 employees. I think I was employee number 11, and it's grown quite significantly since then. And part of it was just because we didn't necessarily have the budget for outside counsel at the time, and I was the person just doing everything, drafting the complaints, going to trial, drafting the patents, kind of top to bottom. And so I was kind of the go-to expert, and it was just more of a I was adding things on to just hyper aggressively control budget initially, and then as that's expanded, just learning where to utilize those resources the best. And so as we were able to have the budget for outside counsel and as our own internal workload continued to migrate and grow, making sure that everybody was utilizing their time the best. And it's frankly, it's like it's not the best utilization of my time anymore to be, showing up in court or doing certain things, rather than having outside counsel do those things now. So understanding kind of like, where your team is and also the growth cycle. So the larger your team is, I think the more you should be able to be capable of having that stuff prepped and utilizing your own team members. But I mean, it started just by force, more or less. But yes, I mean, even like our Ninth Circuit appeals or things that we're doing. I mean, we're generally writing all the written work ourselves.
Okay, so I think an important thing to just note here is most companies cannot litigate without cost constraints. That's just the reality for nearly all legal departments. And given that reality and the fact that budgets shape your enforcement and defense decisions, and that resource allocation matters much as legal merits, and therefore strategic prioritization becomes essential. How do you balance all of this from an in-house perspective, Casey, with sort of protecting the IP with the broader business resource demands? How do you make it all work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's why we end up with having so many IP assets is because, frankly, lawsuits are expensive. They're very slow. Sometimes it's like if it's a trademark dispute. I mean, we had one, it went on 5 years. It takes a long time to deal with at times. So basically, if you can have more assets internally, you might have the ability to say, or just remove a product off a marketplace very quickly, easily, get the infringements down so it doesn't become an actual business problem for the company. Maybe you don't need to file a lawsuit. And at that point, now the product's down, you're communicating like through a C&D and a letter and trying to deal with a settlement. So building out the IP portfolio has allowed us to save on the litigation budget because we don't have to be as aggressive using potentially a lawsuit when we have five potential assets that read directly on another listing. We can get it down from almost any marketplace, through simple reports, and then a C and D or a letter discussion with them is strong enough and convincing enough where it's like, if there was one asset, maybe they want to file a DJ and fight it, but now they realize that, you know, of the five assets, three to four of them are so crystal clear that, they're going to end up with liability. So they kind of come to the table and litigation's not even necessary. So I think making sure that you have a really robust internal IP portfolio on your products and are you're creative on that will save on your litigation costs. And to us, that internal spend, which we draft in-house and prosecute most of our IP in-house, if not all of it, is always a good cost savings on the litigation side. And so a lot of times when those are really great, we're never having to file a suit. I mean, we're pretty much able to clear the marketplace very quickly, efficiently, and completely.
And when we had prepped, you had mentioned that part of the overall strategy and sort of your decision tree for deciding about whether this is a good case for litigation or what type of litigation, or maybe using something like Amazon Patent Express or one of these other takedown programs, you're frequently thinking about the velocity of the potential target. And can you just talk a little bit about what that is and how you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, so one element of the velocity is, um, like I said, lawsuits are slow, and the ability to get down products quickly is kind of pays dividends. The worst case scenario, and typically what happens is people look at other people. You can imagine yourself driving on the freeway at 85 miles an hour because everybody else is doing it. Um, it's a common theme in the marketplaces where if they see a knockoff or something else that's similar and they see it for sale, then they end up thinking that it's okay and they'll do it as well. And then now instead of one, you have two, now you have five, now you have 10. If you're trying to draft up a very complicated lawsuit or you are trying to deal with these things individually in federal court, um, you might end up with that product still listed for sale for 18 months. And by then, you might have 30 or 40 different companies doing the same thing, and the problem's just massive, and your sales are just getting crushed. So, having the ability to address things on the front end very quickly. If one pops up, gets taken down, eventually that gets typically relayed back to the factory or wherever it was the mold maker or the product maker. They might try to sell it to another third party seller or something else like that. If that one gets taken down again, everyone kind of goes back. They want their money back, or they're kind of dealing with the factory. Eventually, they stop making that product. It's not viable. They realize that their products are going to get locked up, destroyed. So having assets to deal with things on the front end quickly prevents the 30 or 40 other duplications that happen. And so uh, it's a difficult game, can a lot of times feel like whack-a-mole. But if you're quick and efficient on the front end, typically you can get things shut down permanently. And if you wait too long and your litigation goes on 4 years, 5 years before you take care of a problem, you might take care of that one infringer and then the cat's out of the bag and it just becomes so difficult to kind of even police something that ship is sailed. So, um, yeah, the front end enforcement is very vital in our industry.
And that's a good segue into the next slide, which is essentially, as we've been saying, cost strategy is litigation strategy. And a lot of the cost strategy is driven by these early decisions in cases, as you were just saying. Um, from your perspective and experience, what are the early decisions that have the biggest impact on downstream budget? Is it as simple as deciding what claims deciding what claims you want to include and exclude, or do you think it's slightly more complicated than
I
that?
think it's probably slightly more complicated. It definitely has the claims are expand the budget or contract the budget, but I don't think they're necessarily the driver. I think the driver really is like um, understanding the third party. And so, is this a one-off mom and pop shop that's not a really big deal to the industry or the consumer? They don't have the wherewithal, the viability, the connections to actually be a real player in the industry. Or is it something where you see a major trend where you're like, no, no, this is a major competitor. They're encroaching on our IP. They have the wherewithal, the ability, the growth, and the expansion, the velocity that this is going to be a major problem for the company in 5 years. And it might be one or two infringements now, but we can see that turning into 20, 40, 50 plus. Um, those two things are very different scenarios, and they deserve different attention and different budgets. And once you decide it's the latter, the budget's higher, and you want it to be higher. It's more important, um, and it's going to cost more, and you might need more completeness, and you might need more leverage. And frankly, the former is um, more suited for individual products, single product removal. But litigation is great for leverage, clearing industry space, understanding how to come to agreements between other companies, and making sure that people kind of stay in their lane. And so having the litigation puts you usually in a better position to get those types of agreements. And so if the goal is getting one of those types of agreements, getting people to move off certain industries, getting people to exit space, um, where the company is going to be viable in a growing company, that leans towards litigation, leans towards the bigger budget, and you should be prepared on the beginning that that might be more costly. So it's really understanding is like, is that where you want to end up? Or is this really just something where we need a product removal and we can kind of go forward? So really, it's about understanding the opponent and where we think the opponent is going to be in 3 to 5 years. And so, is it going to be a problem? Okay, it kind of goes into a second basket. And if it's not really going to be a big problem, it's a one-off, then we're attempting to just be as efficient and quick as possible.
So let's talk really quickly about some different vehicles you have to try and actually budget and manage the cost of litigation. Now, this is not going to be a small presentation on litigation funding. I'm going to sort of quickly cover what it is so that people know. I know that some people feel very strongly about litigation finance one way or the other. The reality, regardless of how you feel about it, though, is that it is a tool that in-house counsel can use to help manage the cost of litigation. So I think it's important for everyone to at least know what it is and have a general sense for it. So fundamentally, litigation finance shifts some litigation risk externally, and it's shifting them externally to third parties that are going to fund litigation related costs in exchange for a return if the case is ultimately successful. And usually, litigation funding deals involve funding 100% of the costs and about 50% of the attorney's fees. And that 50% is variable, but right around these days, it's about 50%. And then the attorneys are required to take 50% on contingency. The funding is almost always non-recourse, and that's just like a contingency fee case. If the case isn't ultimately successful, you don't have to repay the monies that were deployed to you. And the structures really do vary across from, are you talking about a single case deal or you're talking about a portfolio deal? There's sort of different structures for those two things. And even with inside of those, the key thing is these lit funding deals really are bespoke for each individual case or portfolio of cases that are being done. So there is no really one size fits all for these deals. I think one important point I will just raise, which is be aware that the use of litigation finance does not necessarily signal weakness. And I think if you talk to people that have a good understanding about how the diligence process works in a lit funding deal, they would actually tell you that they believe it shows that the cases are actually stronger. And we don't need to get into the why of that really today. But if you understand, it would sort of be like if you only if you only get paid back by winning, are you likely to bet on cases that you have a high probability you think are going to lose? And the answer to that is no. And so if you spent an awful lot of time doing diligence on these cases, you're probably only going to be investing on the ones that you think are going to be winners, all things being equal. So, Casey, have you thought about using litigation finance at PMP?
Yeah, I mean, I keep in contact with a lot of different companies that do it. We touch base all the time. My stars have never really kind of aligned for us in the perfect case to utilize it. But yeah, I mean, it's a tool that I'm always aware of. I have conversations with them, often. Like you mentioned, I don't think it shows a sign of weakness. Frankly, even on the other side, if you know that whether you get the agreement or not, but you understand that they're probably financed or have some financial backing from a third party. Um, Typically, I think that uh, makes it a little harder to litigate against that person because uh, usually finances can help shape and squeeze litigation. You know that the other side might not want to spend money. And so it's like if you're doing a ton of depots and discovery and their bills are going up, you know that your leverage might increase because they don't want to be seeing those bills. And you know how, they get a big massive discovery bill and then you kind of re-engage in settlement discussions. Those can be kind of good timing. But if they got financing, and they're not really paying the same, those things might not matter. And so their position might be stronger on the leverage side simply because they aren't getting squeezed as much financially. Um, and you can utilize that to your advantage. I mean, you can talk to opposing counsel and even hint at the fact that like, hey, look, this isn't as a big financial risk for you guys as it is for them. Um, and it can be a position of strength. So I mean, I've always liked it. Frankly, our goal is to try to get things down very quickly. Um, and when you're getting things down very quickly, sometimes the damages are not very large, right? I mean, if you're talking about a container of a couple hundred units or new listings or a new company doing something, it's like if you're efficient on your enforcement side, maybe litigation financing doesn't necessarily align. That said, if you're maybe a little late to the party or you're more utility patent focused and you're talking about someone who has a massive ability and a ton of sales or you didn't discover it for a couple years and you realize that there's this massive amount of damages, um, then litigation funding really does make a lot more sense. Because if there's a massive amount of damages and you have that pathway ahead, that's when you're going to need all the experts. You're going to need the damages experts. You're going to need the details, and really to kind of get from like start to finish, it's going to be more expensive. But if the back end justifies it, those are the kind of where the stars would align for us for wanting to utilize litigation financing, and that goes back to that original goal setting of certainty. It's like, okay, the principals would like having like, okay, well, we're only be paying 50% of the attorney's costs. And so that's a way to like justify, okay, should we be going forward with this case or not? What's your potential maximum out of pocket here? And if that's at 50% of where it was, maybe that's the tipping point of actually like going forward or not on some of those cases.
Yeah, and the point that you're sort of making about the damages have to justify the funding model. Just so people sort of have in their head a rule of thumb in the lit funding business is essentially you need the amount of money that you want to finance needs to be 1/10 of the expected recovery. So the damages need to be 10x what you want to finance. Okay, so why are companies using litigation finance? And if you listen to Burford, who's the 800-pound gorilla in the space of litigation funding, they say that over 50% of the cases that they finance now are for Fortune 100 companies. I don't have any reason to believe that that's untruthful, but I think even if it's half that number, that's still an awful lot of pretty profitable companies that are utilizing litigation funding, and why. You know, at bottom, it's another form of financial leverage. And I think everyone that is familiar with corporate mergers and acquisitions know that debt financing is a form of leverage, and companies love to do that because they don't have to put all the money out on day one. That's the same with litigation funding. It allows you to litigate a case at the same time you're also spending the monies that you would have been spending on that on your core business function. You can do both things at once. Um, I talked a little bit about diligence on the last slide, and what is that, and what do funders go into, and what are they looking at when they're trying to decide whether they want to fund? They're looking at both legal and economic considerations. They're evaluating the strengths of the claims. They're evaluating the damages and the ability to collect. they're evaluating the counsel quality and the timeline and the risk profile. So it's not a situation where funders are evaluating just the legal merits. They're evaluating the entirety of the investment risk. Advantages and risks of litigation finance. I think the big one that I want to hit on here is just the disclosure issues, and I want to make sure that anyone that's on the call that's thinking about this, you need to go into it knowing that there is a risk that documents that you provide to a litigation funder, diligence documents to try and get funding, those might become discoverable during litigation. And not saying it's guaranteed it's going to happen, but they could be. So that's the one risk that I want to make sure I flag for everyone so that you have in the back of your head that if you're thinking about doing this, you need to have a serious conversation internally, or if you're outside counsel with your clients about this is a risk and make sure everyone understands it and signs off on it as okay to move forward. Um, Again, there's ethical and strategic considerations. As I mentioned, the big one is just the fact that some of these materials could become discoverable. And what you're turning over to a funder is essentially a, very detailed analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of a case. And that's what they're going to require. It's usually a pretty long memo. And you really need to be cognizant of the fact that there is a possibility that that might have to be turned over to the other side. And so you have to think long and hard about that. And, there are strategies to help limit the disclosure of those types of things too. Okay. Budgeting and fee strategies. I think everyone that's on this call has a pretty good understanding of how you budget around the typical billable hour. And that's sort of not super interesting. Let's talk about how you budget around some alternative fee arrangements. So we have on the slide essentially the three big ones, fixed budget by phase rather than the entire case, success-based structure, and hybrid approaches of sort of any of these two or a hybrid of billable and success or whatever you want to do. Casey, which of these do you think create the best alignment in your experience and sort of what's your favorite, if you have?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love hybrid fee structures and approaches generally. I've done lots of different ones over the years. My favorite is a success bonus. I love having motivations aligned between the parties. I love having outside counsel having a little bit of skin in the game. I love having the discounts that you can negotiate. And should you lose, it's cheaper. Should you win, you're happy on the win. And frankly, it kind of feels good to share a little bit with the outside if they did a good job. So I love having a success bonus for a reduced hourly is my favorite. But I use a lot of different fee structures, including, say I potentially want to file say something as simple as like a motion to compel on something that is maybe a little silly. And then you're like, hey, let's just get a fixed cost for something. And you could just literally negotiate fixed costs on individual motions. Um, so I've had phased budgets. So it's like, okay, up into the summary judgment, we'll go hourly at a certain rate with a cap. We'll have a trial cap. You can negotiate different rates for different phases throughout the whole process. You're like, okay, well, during initial and beginning discovery, I want, a reduced rate, but then we're going to bump it up should we get into more complex matters and things. So, I mean, you can literally phase both the hourly and the caps and success bonuses for each one, and get creative to what works for both parties. Sometimes, someone really might want to go to trial and you guys want to go to trial and they're willing to do it at a discounted rate, to get to trial and to be the trial counsel. And that's a benefit to them. Maybe they want to, they don't have an associate or one of partners really wants to, get time as a trial counsel. And so that's a benefit to them. And so you can kind of negotiate and work with that. But all said and done, my favorite is by far the success bonus. I've done it a lot. I've paid out success bonuses to outside counsel. They're grateful. We're happy internally. Um, And, I've had other ones where we had a success bonus and it wasn't hit and we didn't have to pay it. And then, everyone's like, yeah, that was good. We negotiated a good success bonus on that. And we ended up not having to pay it and we saved some money. So those ones always seem to end up, whether you win or lose, you're happy with the fees and the structure you arranged. I think what you don't want to do is you don't want to just end up with an open hourly with no discussions and no real kind of good budget understanding and just let things kind of run wild. And then you get bills and then you want to complain to your outside counsel or your principals are upset. Um, so frankly, it's, having those conversations and, you can also have your outside counsel be like, hey, look, if you're going to be going over a certain amount per month, give me a ring. If you're going to be sitting here and like if things start getting excessive or like you notice a certain number of hours, like let's chat. Like you can put in different guardrails rather than caps too, just so you can have internal checkpoints. So lots of different ways to kind of manage outside spend, but success bonuses are awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key there is making sure that you have communication and alignment in no matter what you do, so that you avoid the surprise of the, $400,000 legal bill or something like that. Okay, building realistic legal budgets. And I'll do full disclosure and say I worked for a litigation funder for about 8 months. And from that experience, I will say for everybody that's in-house on the call, no more pitch budgets, please. That's the starting point for building realistic budgets is no more pitch budgets. The number of times that I had people coming for funding and they would give a pitch budget and I would look at it and say to them, please give me a worst case scenario budget that you could live with if everything went wrong. And I think that has to be the starting point. But based on that, iterating and updating based on changes of the case, I think are critically important. Casey, what material, I guess two questions. How often do you see litigation budgets materially change? And what material changes are you okay with, and what ones are you not okay with?
Hmm. I mean, my gut reaction is I'm not okay with any of them, but we'll be real. No, we're generally okay with material changes, and I think that comes down to trust with your outside counsel. If you have a good relationship and you trust them, I mean, those aren't material changes, aren't them trying to do a money grab. That's because the outside counsel filed something weird, something happened in the case, new facts were discovered, new products got sold that needed to get added to the case, a new party gets involved. Um, so, all those unexpected changes to budget, I think we're okay with. I mean, the main goal is I think if you've been litigating enough, you've kind of seen where those ebbs and flows can be, and so they're not real. None of them are really that unexpected. It's unfortunate, and I don't like them. But like I said, the main thing on that to me is just trust with the outside counsel or whoever I'm using, and making sure that we're aligned on the goals.
Okay, we've been spending an awful lot of time now talking about efficient litigation, and I think it's worth noting that efficient litigation is not the same thing as under litigating the case. And so, Casey, how do you distinguish between strategic spend and unnecessary spend? Because I think that's ultimately what this is all about, is trying to budget efficiently. You don't want to be weakening your case. And sort of how do you make that determination?
Yeah, that one is hard, and I think the main thing is constant reevaluation of the goals of the company. It's like, yes, you did your initial goal setting, but things can change. Litigation takes a long period of time, and um, frankly, if you're you know pedal to the metal, full speed, whatever budget necessary against a company, and something changes with the other company's business. Say they end up in uh, a different lawsuit, something happens, something materially changes where they're no longer as much of a competitor as they were, and it doesn't look like they're growing on the same velocity and rates that you thought they were. Then having the pedal down almost becomes an immediately unnecessary spend. And so, um, if you are not analyzing your defendant constantly throughout your litigation, there can be tipping points where what was good strategy turns into unnecessary spend, and there's other situations. At that point, it's like, okay, well, they're no longer a huge issue. We need to figure out a way to just wrap this thing up. Whether it's fun to get a jury verdict and prove you're right and get these, big victories or try for them. Ultimately, it's if things have changed, you need to change too. You need to pivot too. You need to have some, gut check on that. Like, even though you're like, hey, this is a really important case, we got to file it. You know, 18 months later, it might not be. And so you might have to be able to go back and re-pressure set things and realize that you need to either back off or re-engage settlement or do something to kind of get out of the litigation because the pedal to the metal plan is just not good business spend. It's taking up too much resources internally. It's taking up too much, resources on cash externally for a problem that the business really uh, is in a big detriment to the business. And so you need to figure out where those resources could be better spent. Because I think everyone internally realizes that we just have finite resources and, you can always spend them somewhere better than litigation usually.
And we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to skip ahead, and I think that's a good segue to get to the settlement portion and how people should be, how we think people should be thinking about settlement. Now, I guess from your perspective, Casey, which of these factors about that are sort of we view are critical for evaluating settlement rationally, which of these factors do you think are the biggest impediment to making settlement decisions rationally?
It's almost always sunk costs to me. It's one I think that are hard for just people generally in life, and it's hard for business owners and stakeholders to come to terms with. It's a very natural feeling to be like, hey, I just spent $600,000 on something. I want that money back. And it's like, frankly, you might spend 2 million bucks more trying to prove that point and you get none of it back. Um, So that 600K of sunk costs, if you had just pivoted then, come to the realization that what's spent is spent, what's the best decision today? You might not have made that same decision, not considering that. You might not have blown the $2 million on the back end and refocused. So I think that's the hardest one. I think that's the hardest one for the principals as well, because they're going to go back and be like, almost always, how much have we spent on this case? Where are we at? And it's like, okay, well, if you say we've spent $500,000, they'd be like, well, they're only offering to settle for 300K. And it's like, they just sit here and they just see the negative $200,000 loss. And it's like, that's a tough one to get around. And so really you know, doing your job to make sure that you're focused on what is now and the best situations moving forward. Um, but I think that is to me the one that I know that people's natural instincts, and you can just see it in their eyes that they're constantly calculating what they've paid, how much they paid outside counsel, what the costs are, what their lost sales are, all those kind of sunk costs that are things in the past can definitely get in the way of coming to terms and settling because people think that if they were wrong, they don't want to go in the hole, and they realize that like maybe eating 20K is your best option, but they feel bad about eating that 20K, and then they're going to go blow a ton of money trying to feel better about it.
We've got time for maybe one more slide. So here, we've spent an awful lot of time talking about this and sort of what we think the best strategy is. From your perspective, both with your time in outside counsel and now a significant amount of time as general in-house counsel, what separates organizations that manage IP disputes effectively from those that don't? Like what's the number one thing that you think successful organizations are doing that organizations that are less successful are failing to?
Yeah, I mean, at least for us internally, I think the most success is making sure that kind of you train employees top to bottom. If you're just running your silo of a legal department, I think that's where costs get out of control and your problems get out of control, hence the costs as well. And so if you can, if you have a team of designers and you're not talking to them about IP, not just on how to protect their IP or to how to fill out their inventor disclosure forms. You want to talk to them about the full scope of what IP protection means, how we're utilizing it as a company, what the benefits are, what to watch out for, both on internally and externally. They can be vital resources to also, they identify infringing products, they can identify other issues. They can become an entire team working for the legal department on a day-to-day basis. And that greatly controls costs because it just reduces problems a tremendous amount. And so um, it's always difficult to want to have those meetings to just go train designers on intellectual property or other things, and they don't might not want to spend, a meeting or the time on that. But it pays dividends on our end and making sure that everybody understands what's going on. So I think training your people internally is highly important, and that's top to bottom. I mean, that's really understanding the full scope, but uh, yeah, I mean, stakeholders on the top, making sure it's like, they don't want to just know what a patent is. They want to know like why you're doing it, how you're going to utilize it, what the strategies are. But train your internal resources, and that's probably your best utilization of time because that's something that works for you on a day-to-day basis.
Well, thank you, Casey. I really appreciate the time you spent and giving everybody your insights. Everyone that joined, thank you so much. I apologize that we had to speed up a little bit at the end. But if you're interested, the next present webinar is going to be on June 17th. So I hope to see you all there. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.